What if the most dangerous thing that can happen to a person is not failing to get what they want, but actually getting it? Most readers are told that Anna Karenina is a tragedy about love. Others argue it's a tragedy about society. About judgment. About rules. About a woman trapped inside a world that refused to make room for her. But what if all of those explanations are pointing at the smoke while missing the fire? Because the truly unsettling question hidden inside this novel is much deeper. What if Anna was not destroyed by the absence of love? What if she was destroyed by asking love to do something it was never designed to do? Think about that for a moment. We tend to imagine desire as a solution. We believe that somewhere ahead of us there is a person, a relationship, an achievement, a dream, a version of life that will finally make everything feel complete. The assumption is so common that we rarely question it. But what if the assumption itself is the trap? What if the thing we call desire is actually a promise our minds make that reality can never fully keep? That is where Anna becomes far more than a literary character. She becomes a mirror. Not because of what happens to her, but because of what she represents. Anna is not merely pursuing a person. She is pursuing a state of being. A feeling of total aliveness. Total certainty. Total fulfillment. And that distinction changes everything. Because a person can be found. A relationship can begin. A dream can come true. But a permanent state of emotional completion? That may be something else entirely. Here's the contradiction that sits at the center of this story. Most people assume suffering comes from not getting what they want. Yet some of the deepest suffering begins after the dream arrives. When reality finally opens the door. When you step inside and discover the room is still empty. That image matters because it points to a mystery that extends far beyond Anna Karenina. How many people spend years chasing a relationship only to discover they are still lonely? How many people reach success and still feel restless? How many people achieve the life they imagined and then find themselves asking a question they never expected to ask: why isn't this enough? The frightening possibility is that the problem was never the dream itself. The problem was the burden placed upon it. Anna's role in this story is not that of a victim alone. She is the embodiment of a profoundly human impulse, the belief that something outside ourselves can finally make us whole. And when that belief becomes absolute, something dangerous begins to happen. Every disappointment becomes catastrophic. Every imperfection becomes unbearable. Every ordinary human limitation starts to feel like betrayal. It's like trying to fill a bottomless cup. You pour love into it. Attention into it. Meaning into it. Hope into it. And somehow it remains empty. That image, the bottomless cup, is one of the most haunting ways to understand Anna Karenina. Because the question Tolstoy leaves hanging over the entire novel is not whether society failed her. It is not even whether love failed her. The real question is far more uncomfortable. What if the thing Anna was searching for never existed in the first place? Here's where the mystery becomes even more unsettling. If Anna's tragedy wasn't caused by the absence of love, then what exactly was she trying to obtain from it? Because people rarely desire things for the reasons they think they do. A person says they want success. But often they want significance. They say they want money. But often they want security. They say they want freedom. But often they want relief from themselves. And perhaps the same question applies here. What if the object of desire was never the true destination? What if it was merely a vehicle carrying a much deeper need? This is where Anna becomes less a character and more a psychological pattern. Not a woman chasing romance. A human being chasing completion. And that distinction matters because completion is a dangerous word. It sounds harmless. Noble, even. Who wouldn't want to feel whole? But hidden inside that desire is a contradiction that Tolstoy seems to understand with frightening clarity. The moment a person begins to believe that another human being can complete them, that person is no longer being asked to be loved. They are being asked to become salvation. And no human being can survive that role. Not because they are flawed, but because they are human. Every relationship eventually encounters reality. Ordinary days. Misunderstandings. Distance. Limitations. The simple fact that another person remains separate from us no matter how deeply we care for them. Yet the mind that seeks completion often interprets those limitations as evidence that something has gone wrong. This is the trap. The seeker is not searching for a person anymore. The seeker is searching for a permanent emotional state. And reality cannot produce permanence. Not in love. Not in achievement. Not even in happiness. Think about the symbol we introduced earlier, the bottomless cup. Most people assume the cup is empty because it lacks something. But what if the cup remains empty because it was never designed to hold what is being poured into it? That possibility changes the entire conversation. Because now the problem is not scarcity. The problem is expectation. And once expectation becomes absolute, disappointment stops being an occasional experience. It becomes a way of seeing the world. Suddenly every imperfection feels enormous. Every uncertainty feels threatening. Every fluctuation in emotion feels like evidence that fulfillment is slipping away. This is why the conflict hidden inside Anna Karenina extends far beyond one individual life. It reaches into a recurring pattern of human behavior. The athlete who wins the championship and feels strangely hollow. The entrepreneur who sells the company and immediately searches for the next mountain. The person who spends years pursuing the perfect relationship only to discover that loneliness has followed them into it. Different stories. Same structure. The promise changes. The hunger remains. And here's the revelation that makes the mystery even deeper. What if desire itself is not the villain? What if the real danger emerges when desire becomes identity? When the thing we want slowly transforms into the thing we believe we must have in order to be complete? Because once that happens, losing the object feels like losing yourself. And gaining it creates an equally terrifying problem. Now it has to keep saving you. Forever. No relationship can do that. No achievement can do that. No external reality can do that. Which brings us to a question that sits at the center of this entire psychological puzzle. If the human heart keeps trying to find permanence in things that are inherently temporary, then what was Anna truly searching for beneath love, beneath longing, beneath desire itself? And more importantly, what did Tolstoy understand about that search that most readers never notice? There is a point in this psychological pattern where desire stops behaving like desire at all. It starts behaving like necessity. And once something becomes necessity, it no longer negotiates with reality. It only demands. But here is the question that breaks the surface tension of everything that came before it. If the human mind begins to treat emotional fulfillment as something absolute, what happens when reality refuses to comply? Not once. Not twice. But repeatedly, in small ordinary moments that never feel dramatic enough to warn you, yet accumulate into something irreversible. Because this is where the contradiction sharpens. The same mind that believes love should complete it is also the mind that is forced to experience love as incomplete. Two truths, existing at the same time, both felt as equally real. And that internal collision is where instability begins. Not externally. Internally. Anna's role in this structure is no longer just a seeker. She becomes a living tension between expectation and limitation. Between what the heart imagines and what life allows. Between the need for permanence and the nature of change. And that is where escalation begins. Because once a person defines emotional fulfillment as a required condition for existence, every fluctuation in that fulfillment becomes existentially charged. A moment of distance is no longer a moment. It becomes abandonment. A misunderstanding is no longer a misunderstanding. It becomes confirmation of failure. A normal silence becomes a symbolic collapse of meaning. This is the transformation Tolstoy is pointing toward. Not a tragic romance, but a cognitive system breaking under its own demands. Memory fragment, the bottomless cup that does not leak, does not break, but simply never rises in level, no matter how much is poured into it. The unsettling part is not the emptiness. It is the consistency of the emptiness. And then something even more unsettling appears. Because when expectation becomes absolute, reality is no longer experienced as neutral. It is experienced as resistance. Everything that does not fulfill becomes something that is against you. This is where the contradiction evolves into crisis. The seeker begins to interpret limitation as betrayal. Not from other people, but from existence itself. And once existence becomes the source of disappointment, no relationship can stabilize it. No external validation can resolve it. No amount of affection can neutralize it. Here the scale shifts. What began as an individual emotional struggle now mirrors a broader human condition. The modern pursuit of identity through external confirmation follows the same architecture. A message received and not answered quickly enough becomes doubt. A change in tone becomes a threat. A pause becomes a question about worth. Not because reality has changed, but because interpretation has intensified. And the system cannot return to neutrality once it crosses that threshold. This is where the hidden contradiction reveals itself fully. The more absolute the need becomes, the less any solution can satisfy it. Because satisfaction requires finiteness. But the need has become infinite. Memory fragment, a sealed room with no visible exit, where the walls are not closing in, yet the perception of space keeps shrinking. And in that shrinking space, a new question begins to form, not fully visible yet, but impossible to ignore. If fulfillment cannot stabilize the self, and absence cannot define it either, then what exactly is the self trying to achieve through desire? And at that moment, the system stops being about love, or society, or even personal longing. It becomes something far more unstable. A search for a form of completeness that may never have had a reference point in reality at all. And the question that remains is not whether Anna misunderstood love, but whether love was ever the true target in the first place. If the pattern we have been following is correct, then we are approaching a point where the entire structure must be reinterpreted from its foundation. Because the real question is no longer about why emotional fulfillment fails. It is about what kind of structure makes it fail in the same way across completely different lives. And here is where the first true revelation begins to surface. What if the mind is not searching for love at all? What if it is searching for a form of internal stability that it mistakenly translates into external relationships? This is the hidden mechanism beneath everything that has unfolded so far. Not a story of attachment, but a misdirection of function. The mind generates a demand for wholeness, but it has no direct language for wholeness itself. So it projects the demand onto people, onto relationships, onto outcomes that appear emotionally significant. And this is where Anna's role shifts completely in meaning. She is no longer simply a seeker caught in contradiction. She becomes an operating system under a miscalibrated instruction set, trying to execute a command that reality was never designed to fulfill. Memory fragment, a mirror that does not reflect a face, but instead reflects the expectation of a face. The absence is not empty. It is structured. And that is the first critical insight. The absence Anna experiences is not simply loss. It is the mismatch between expectation and the capacity of reality to respond to that expectation. Now the consequence becomes unavoidable. When emotional completion is treated as a requirement rather than an experience, every deviation from it is processed as failure of existence itself. Not failure of circumstance. Failure of reality. This is where the psychological structure begins to collapse inward. Because no external system can continuously satisfy an internal demand that has no limit. And the more intensely that demand grows, the more ordinary life becomes a series of symbolic disappointments. Not because life is cruel, but because interpretation has been elevated beyond what life can provide. Here the scale shifts. Again, what looks like a personal tragedy now resembles a universal cognitive architecture. The same mechanism appears in ambition, in identity formation, in the pursuit of meaning. A person does not only want a result. They want the result to resolve the feeling of incompleteness that preceded the desire itself. But that feeling was never caused by the absence of the result. It is part of the structure of wanting. Memory fragment, a sealed horizon where every step forward does not expand the world, but instead reveals another horizon already waiting beyond it. And this leads to a deeper revelation. The problem is not that desire is too strong. The problem is that desire is being used as a substitute for something it cannot become. A stabilizer of identity. A container for selfhood. A guarantee of permanence inside a system defined by impermanence. And once desire is forced into that role, it begins to generate tension that no fulfillment can dissolve. Because fulfillment answers what you get, not what you are trying to become through getting it. This is the silent fracture beneath the entire structure. Anna's experience is not an exception. It is an exaggeration of a mechanism that exists in ordinary life. Where meaning is outsourced. Where identity is negotiated through external confirmation. Where internal emptiness is interpreted as something that can be solved externally. And yet the more precise this mechanism becomes, the more unavoidable a final question emerges. If desire is not actually pointing toward objects, people, or outcomes, but toward a deeper need for internal coherence, then what happens when a mind discovers that no external structure can ever provide that coherence permanently? At that moment, the entire system stops being about love. It stops being about loss. It stops being about society. And it begins to reveal something far more unsettling. That the search itself may be built on a misunderstanding so fundamental that correcting it would not simply change the outcome, it would change the meaning of the search entirely. The deeper question now is no longer about why the structure fails. It is about whether the structure was ever designed to succeed in the way the mind expects it to. Because once you follow the pattern far enough, a disturbing clarity begins to emerge. What if the human mind is not misinterpreting desire by accident, but by design? Not biological design in a literal sense, but cognitive design. A system built to generate motion, not completion. To keep seeking, not to arrive. And if that is true, then the entire foundation of Anna's inner collapse shifts from emotional tragedy to structural inevitability. The core revelation is this. The mind does not actually pursue fulfillment. It pursues the sensation of approaching fulfillment. Because approaching creates meaning. Arrival ends it. And this is where Anna's entire psychological world becomes legible at its deepest level. She is not failing to find stability. She is experiencing what happens when a system designed for pursuit encounters the illusion of arrival. Memory fragment, a staircase that exists not to reach a destination, but to confirm the existence of climbing itself. The moment the top is reached, the structure loses its purpose, even if the view is perfect. This is the hidden architecture beneath everything. Desire is not a bridge toward completion. It is a mechanism that generates direction. But when that mechanism is mistaken for a path to permanence, it begins to collapse under its own expectation. And Anna represents the exact point where that collapse becomes visible. Not because she wants too much, but because she believes that wanting has an end point. Here is where the insight expands beyond character and into human structure. Every identity built on external fulfillment inherits the same instability. Because external reality is always partial. Always temporary. Always shifting. Which means no external condition can function as a permanent anchor for internal coherence. Yet the mind keeps attempting exactly that. It tries to turn people into anchors. It tries to turn achievements into anchors. It tries to turn moments into anchors. And each attempt creates a subtle but accumulating pressure against reality itself. A pressure that cannot be resolved by more intensity. Only by reinterpretation. Memory fragment, A. Glass surface reflecting a complete image that disappears the moment you try to step into it, revealing only the space you were already standing in. At this point, the consequence becomes unavoidable. If meaning is generated through pursuit rather than possession, then possession cannot preserve meaning. It can only transform it. Often into emptiness. Not because fulfillment is fake, but because fulfillment is not designed to be static. This is the scale shift Tolstoy embeds inside the emotional surface of the story. What appears as personal longing is actually a demonstration of a universal cognitive law. That consciousness confuses intensity for truth, and confuses arrival for resolution. But neither one guarantees stability. Only motion. Which leads to a philosophical tension that cannot be ignored. If the mind is structurally incapable of converting external completion into internal permanence, then what exactly is the function of desire in human experience? Is it a guide toward truth? Or is it a generator of direction that only becomes painful when mistaken for something else? And if that misunderstanding is not rare, but foundational, then the entire architecture of how meaning is built begins to look like it is pointing somewhere we have not yet fully understood. The consequence of this structure is not simply emotional instability. It is the gradual transformation of how reality itself is interpreted. Once the mind stops treating desire as a signal and starts treating it as a destination, every experience becomes filtered through a single distortion. Not what is happening, but whether what is happening moves you closer to completion. And that shift is irreversible in subtle ways. Because it reprograms attention. It changes what is noticed, what is ignored, what is amplified into meaning, and what is dismissed as failure. In this state, nothing remains neutral. A quiet moment is no longer quiet. It becomes absence of fulfillment. A stable relationship is no longer stable. It becomes insufficient progress. Even ordinary emotional fluctuation begins to feel like structural instability. And this is the hidden consequence embedded in the architecture we have been tracing. The pursuit of completeness does not end in completion. It ends in reinterpretation of everything as incomplete. Memory fragment, a landscape that never changes shape, but is always perceived as lacking something essential, as if the eyes themselves have learned to search for absence rather than presence. This is where the legacy of the pattern begins to extend beyond a single life. Because this is not only Anna's cognitive environment. It is a recurring structure in human meaning-making. When desire becomes identity, dissatisfaction becomes permanent. Not because life is hostile, but because perception is calibrated toward absence. And once calibrated, it does not easily return to equilibrium. This is why the impact extends far beyond individual tragedy. It becomes a cultural logic. A silent assumption embedded in how people relate to success, relationships, and self-worth. That somewhere, just beyond the current state, there is a version of life that will finally resolve internal tension. But the system never confirms arrival. Only continuation. And so the tension becomes inherited. Passed from one expectation to another. From one object to the next. From one relationship to the next. Memory fragment, a chain of locked doors where each key opens a room that looks almost identical to the last, yet the search continues because the belief in a final room remains intact. This is the legacy of the structure. Not resolution, but repetition. And in that repetition lies the deeper philosophical weight of the entire narrative. Because what appears to be personal longing is actually a transferable framework. A way of interpreting existence that can be transmitted without language. Through expectation. Through comparison. Through unspoken standards of what a life is supposed to feel like. And the most unsettling part is that this framework does not require failure to persist. It thrives even in success. Because success, once interpreted through the lens of incompleteness, becomes another step that failed to finish the journey. So the system expands. Quietly. Without resistance. Until life itself becomes a continuous measurement against an invisible finish. Line. Memory fragment, the horizon that retreats at the same speed as movement toward it, never closer, never farther, only persistently defining direction. At the scale of the story, this means Anna is not an exception within her world. She is an exposed version of a hidden rule operating beneath it. A rule that transforms emotional experience into a pursuit without termination point. And that is the legacy Tolstoy leaves behind in this interpretation. Not a warning about love, but a reflection on the structure of longing itself. A structure that does not end when desire is fulfilled. Because fulfillment was never the endpoint it was assumed to be. Which leads to a final tension that cannot yet resolve. If perception is shaped more by the direction of desire than by its outcomes, then what would it mean for a mind to stop interpreting life as a movement toward completion at all? And if such a shift is even possible, what would remain of meaning once the idea of a final answer is removed from the system entirely? In the end, the most unsettling realization is not that desire is flawed, or that love is insufficient, or even that reality is limited. It is that the mind continues searching even after it has already produced every answer it was capable of producing. As if the act of searching is itself the only thing that makes the system feel alive. And that is where everything collapses into a final clarity. Not resolution. Not closure. But recognition. The structure we have been tracing is not a story about one person failing to find fulfillment. It is a reflection of how consciousness organizes meaning when it cannot tolerate emptiness. Meaning is not discovered. It is constructed in motion. And motion only exists as long as something remains unresolved. This is why the legacy of this narrative does not end with its characters. It continues inside the viewer, inside the reader, inside anyone who has ever believed that a single outcome could stabilize an entire life. Memory fragment, the bottomless cup that was never meant to be filled, only held, as if its emptiness was not a flaw but the condition that makes movement possible. When seen through this lens, every pursuit changes its function. Relationships are no longer destinations. They are temporary structures that reveal how the mind negotiates closeness. Achievements are no longer endpoints. They are brief confirmations that direction still exists. Even identity itself becomes less like a fixed truth and more like a continuous adjustment between expectation and experience. And yet, nothing in this realization removes desire. It only changes its meaning. The search does not end. But its assumed purpose dissolves. Memory fragment, the horizon that never arrives closer, yet continues to define what direction feels like, even when there is no final place to stand. This is the quiet inheritance left behind by the entire journey. Not a warning. Not a lesson. But a mirror that remains active long after the story has ended. Because once you see the pattern, you begin to notice it everywhere. In ambition that never settles. In love that seeks permanence inside impermanence. In success that immediately redefines itself the moment it is reached. In the subtle human refusal to accept that some forms of motion do not lead anywhere final. And maybe that is the deepest tension of all. We are meaning-making systems living inside a reality that does not promise final meaning. We generate direction. But we cannot guarantee destination. We generate expectation. But we cannot enforce completion. And still, the system continues. Not because it is mistaken, but because it is alive. So the question that remains is not whether fulfillment exists, or whether desire is justified. The question is something more disquieting. If the human mind only knows how to exist through movement toward something, then what happens to consciousness when there is nothing left to complete, and only the awareness of movement itself remains?